My name is Berenice Michael. I am 30 years old, and last month my father stood up in front of 50 people at his birthday dinner and announced that I was a complete failure who produced nothing of value. He looked me in the eye and told a room full of his friends that my career in corporate acquisitions was fake work, while he praised my brother for inheriting the family warehouse. What he did not know was that while he was giving that speech, my phone buzzed in my lap with a final deed transfer. I had just quietly purchased the physical building his company had leased for 30 years. Before I tell you how I handed him a 300% rent increase and legally dismantled his ego, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Morning Revenge. But only if you genuinely connect with this story, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from right now. I always love seeing the ages of the people in our community. Now let me take you back to that steakhouse in downtown Chicago on the night the power dynamic in my family permanently shifted. The ice in my lowball glass shifted and settled with a dull clink against the heavy crystal. I sat at a long mahogany table in a private dining room on Michigan Avenue. The air smelled of charred ribeye, roasted garlic, and expensive bourbon. My father, Thomas Michael, stood at the head of the table. It was his 60th birthday, and he had surrounded himself with the only currency he truly valued, which was men who looked and sounded exactly like him. He wore a charcoal suit that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders, looking like a man built for the concrete floors of an industrial warehouse rather than the velvet booths of a fine dining restaurant. Around him sat his loyal lieutenants. These were men with calloused hands and fading hairlines who ran shipping logistics, wholesale supply lines, and freight yards across Illinois. They were the old guard of the Midwestern blue-collar elite. In their world, if a business could not be loaded onto a wooden pallet and driven down the interstate, it was not real work. I sat quietly near the end of the table, maintaining a relaxed posture against the leather banquette. I am a senior commercial acquisitions director and a REIT portfolio manager. I evaluate mezzanine debt and acquire distressed commercial portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But in this room, I was practically invisible. To my father's right sat David, my older brother. At 32, David possessed our father's height, but none of his actual grit. He wore a tailored Italian suit and a stainless steel watch that I knew from a casual glance at his debt-to-income ratio he had financed at a terrible interest rate. David nodded along with every word our father spoke, playing the role of the dutiful golden successor. Beside David sat his wife, Maya. She wore a sharp architectural dress and kept her gaze fixed on her sparkling water. Maya was a senior corporate auditor, and she was far too smart for my brother. Our eyes met briefly across the table, and in that split-second exchange, I felt a shared, silent exhaustion. We both navigated the suffocating gravity of the Michael family patriarchy, and we both knew the financial rot hiding beneath the floorboards of my father's company. 35 years, my father boomed, raising his glass of bourbon. His voice carried the raspy cadence of a man who had spent decades shouting over the roar of diesel engines. 35 years building Michael & Sons Industrial Supply from a single leased garage into a distribution hub that feeds this entire city. We did not do it with algorithms. We did not do it with hedge funds. We did it with sweat and steel and showing up before the sun. A chorus of gruff agreement echoed down the table. Stan, a freight manager with a thick gray mustache, pounded a heavy fist on the wood in approval. A legacy is a physical thing. My father continued, leaning forward so his knuckles rested on the table. You can touch it. You can stand under its roof. That is why David is sitting where he is today. He works with his hands. He walks the warehouse floor. He understands that business is built on tangible inventory and not fairy dust. My father turned his gaze down the table and zeroed in on me. The celebratory warmth in his eyes hardened into a familiar, condescending glint. "And then we have Berenice," he said. The ambient noise in the room seemed to evaporate. The clinking of silverware stopped. The waiters pouring wine stepped back into the shadows. Even David stopped smiling and leaned back in his chair to watch the spectacle. "Berenice," my father repeated, shaking his head with a slow, theatrical sigh. "My daughter." The senior director of whatever it is this week. Corporate acquisitions, portfolio management, fictional paper pushing. He sneered and gestured vaguely with his free hand, moving imaginary numbers from one computer screen to another. You wear a nice suit, sweetheart, but let us call it what it is. You do not produce anything. You do not build anything. You just shuffle digital dollars for a corporate trust and call it a hard day's work. Stan chuckled. A few of the other men exchanged knowing glances. David smirked and swirled the red wine in his glass. I have told her for years, my father said, addressing the room again. You cannot build a legacy on paper. You cannot hand down a spreadsheet. She sits up in her glass tower in the loop, looking down on the people doing the actual work, thinking she is successful. But at the end of the day, it is just smoke and mirrors. A disappointment. If the power goes out tomorrow, everything she does vanishes. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. My father thrived on opposition. He wanted me to flush, to argue, and to defend my career so he could swap my arguments away with more blue-collar insults. I did none of those things. I felt the cold condensation on the outside of my glass. I calculated the specific gravity of the moment and detached my ego from the equation. Getting angry was a poor investment of my energy. You are right, Dad, I said smoothly, raising my glass a fraction of an inch. I do not build anything. I just manage assets. My father snorted, satisfied with my capitulation. Glad you finally admit it, he said. Now, let us get back to the real world. He turned his attention back to Stan and launched into a loud story about a recent shipment of industrial piping. I lowered my glass. Beneath the white linen tablecloth, my secure mobile device vibrated in my lap. It was a single, prolonged pulse. I slid the phone out of my clutch and angled the screen to hide the glare. It was an encrypted email from my lead transactional attorney at the office. The subject line read, West Loop Industrial Park escrow closed. I tapped the screen and read the brief message. The deed transfer is executed. The holding company and all associated property titles have been officially absorbed by B. Michael, LLC. The county recorder has filed the documents. You hold sole ownership of the physical premises at 4040 West Loop. I stared at the glowing text. 4040 West Loop was a sprawling, 60-year-old brick warehouse complex. It was also the permanent physical headquarters of Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. For the past month, while my father was busy preparing for his birthday and David was busy leasing cars he could not afford, I had been methodically tracking the distressed debt of the property management group that owned their building. My father, in his infinite arrogance, had operated on a handshake lease extension with a landlord who was quietly going bankrupt. He had ignored the shifting market, believing his long tenure in the building made him invincible. He was wrong. I locked my phone screen and slipped it back into my bag. I looked down the table at my father, who was currently laughing loudly at a joke Stan had just told. My father looked triumphant, like a king holding court in a rented dining room, entirely unaware that the crown had just been stolen from his head. He had just spent 5 minutes mocking me for pushing paper. He had called me a disappointment who owned nothing tangible. He claimed that a legacy was a physical roof you could stand under. I ran my thumb along the heavy rim of my crystal glass, feeling the sharp, precise edge. The irony sat like a physical weight in my chest. My father was right about one thing, because real power was owning the bricks. David, oblivious to the silent transaction that had just occurred, leaned over and clapped our father on the shoulder. To the warehouse, Dad, David cheered, holding up his wine glass. Another 35 years. Damn straight, my father agreed, clinking his glass against his son's. Another 35 years under our own roof. I smiled a cold corporate expression that I usually reserved for the negotiation table right before I finalized a hostile takeover. I placed my empty glass onto the mahogany table. The dull thud sounded exactly like a gavel closing a court session. I had the paperwork. I had the deed. The only thing left to do was draft the notice to quit. The old-school patriarchy of Chicago's industrial sector was about to get a very modern reality check. Exactly 1 month before my father's birthday dinner, I sat at my desk on the 42nd floor of our LaSalle Street headquarters. The downtown train rattled the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office. It was a faint, rhythmic vibration that I felt through the soles of my leather shoes. Up here, the air smelled of ozone and filtered ventilation. It was a sterile, controlled environment that stood in sharp contrast to the grit and engine exhaust of the West Loop Industrial District where I grew up. I stared at the dual monitors on my desk. The screen on the right displayed the quarterly earnings of our real estate investment trust. The screen on the left displayed a gold mine of catastrophic financial negligence. The negligence belonged entirely to my father. For 30 years, he had operated Michael & Sons Industrial Supply under a fundamentally flawed premise. He believed that loyalty was a tangible asset. Back in the 1990s, he had struck an informal handshake agreement with the original owner of the West Loop property. They drank cheap beer in the loading bay and shook hands on a fixed commercial rent. My father despised lawyers. He hated paperwork. He viewed legally binding contracts as a tool used by weak men who lacked honor. So he never signed a long-term commercial lease. He just paid his rent on the first of every month and assumed the business world would always operate on his terms. But the real estate market does not run on honor. It runs on leverage. The original owner passed away a decade ago. His heirs had zero interest in managing a decaying brick warehouse, so they sold the property to a mid-tier holding company. That holding company immediately used the building as collateral to finance a series of bad retail investments across the Midwest. When the retail sector contracted, the holding company defaulted on their loans. The West Loop property fell into receivership. My father never noticed any of this. He was too busy walking the floor and praising my brother David for driving a forklift to realize that the ground beneath their feet was sinking. The commercial bank that took over the debt was looking to liquidate the asset fast. They wanted the distressed property off their balance sheet before the end of the fiscal quarter. That is where I stepped in. I did not use my personal name or my corporate account to initiate the purchase. I engaged a boutique legal firm in Delaware to establish a proxy limited liability company. I named the entity B. Michael LLC. The structure provided total anonymity, shielding the acquisition from public records and family scrutiny. I drafted the purchase agreement, proposing to buy the distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. The numbers were so low they were almost insulting, but I knew the bank was desperate for liquidity. My concentration broke when a shadow fell across my desk. Gavin, one of our senior risk analysts, leaned against the glass partition. He held a sleek tablet in his hand and wore an expression of mild confusion. Gavin was a man who lived and died by market trends, and he had spent the morning reviewing my recent acquisition proposals. He tapped the screen of his tablet and asked why I was looking at the filings for this West Loop parcel. He pointed out that the financials were a mess. The roof was past its life expectancy, the heating systems were non-compliant, and the current tenant was paying a lease rate from 2 decades ago. He questioned why I was deploying capital into a decaying industrial site when we usually acquire premium office space or mixed-use developments. He stated bluntly that the property looked like a severe liability. I did not blink. I kept my eyes focused on the spreadsheet, masking a deeply personal vendetta with cold, undeniable corporate logic. I told Gavin to look at the zoning maps. I explained that the City Council was currently reviewing a proposal to rezone that entire 3-block radius for high-density residential development. The industrial sector in that specific neighborhood was dying. In 5 years, that area would be flooded with luxury condominiums and artisanal coffee shops. I kept my voice level and professional, assuring him that we were acquiring the dirt and not the brick. I laid out the strategy, which was to buy the distressed debt now, force the current underperforming tenant out, and hold the parcel until the rezoning was approved. The land value alone would triple. Gavin studied my face, searching for a crack in my logic. He found none, because the mathematics were flawless. The gentrification play was a standard industry tactic. He did not know that the underperforming tenant I planned to force out was the man whose last name I shared. Gavin nodded slowly, conceding the point. He noted that it was a ruthless play and added that the current tenant would not survive a market rate adjustment. He predicted they would be bankrupt in a month. I turned my attention back to my monitors and told him that is the nature of the market. Businesses that fail to adapt do not survive. Gavin walked away satisfied with the strategic projection. He had no idea he had just validated my execution plan. I waited until the office emptied out for the evening. The city lights of Chicago flickered to life outside my window, casting long shadows across my desk. My encrypted email inbox chimed. The final digital purchase agreements had arrived from the bank. The Delaware proxy had cleared the regulatory hurdles. All that remained was the authorized signature. I opened the document. It was 70 pages of dense legalese stipulating the transfer of deed, the assumption of liability, and the immediate termination of the previous holding company's rights. I pulled a heavy silver pen from my desk drawer. It was a graduation gift from my mother, given to me before she passed away. My father had refused to attend the ceremony, claiming he could not take time away from the warehouse to watch me accept a piece of paper. I unspooled the cap. The ink flowed smoothly across the signature line on the final page. B. Michael, Managing Director. With those few strokes, I transferred ownership of the warehouse from a faceless bank to myself. I cut off my father's safety net with surgical precision. He had spent his entire life building a kingdom of steel and inventory, but he had forgotten to secure the dirt it stood on. The digital confirmation flashed on my screen, indicating the funds had been wired and the deed was officially recorded. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and listened to the distant rumble of the train below. The silence in my office was deafening. The Proxy LLC was now the legal landlord. The acquisition was complete, but owning the building was only the first step. Ownership meant nothing without enforcement. My father operated under the illusion that he controlled his destiny because he yelled the loudest on the warehouse floor. It was time to introduce him to the crushing weight of commercial real estate law. I opened a new blank document on my computer. I typed the heading, Notice to Quit, and began calculating the new lease terms. The blue-collar arrogance that had sustained his ego for 30 years was about to meet a market-rate correction. The cursor blinked at the end of the paragraph. I stared at the bright white screen of my monitor, reading the final clause of the legal addendum I had just drafted. It was a standard commercial notice to quit, but the numbers I inputted were anything but standard. I typed in a 300% market rate correction for the monthly rent. Under the strict guidelines of Illinois commercial tenancy codes, a landlord holding an expired month-to-month lease agreement possessed the right to adjust the rent to reflect current market valuations. The previous holding company had neglected to update the terms for over a decade, leaving an exploitable vulnerability. My father operated his entire business philosophy on outdated loyalty. He firmly believed that if you paid your bills on time and looked a man in the eye, your position was secure. He ran his distribution hub on the premise that relationships governed commerce. I operated on a different frequency entirely. I relied on ruthless market analytics, risk assessment, and unfeeling mathematics. I knew that loyalty was a liability waiting to be exploited. I opened a secondary window on my desktop, bringing up the clandestine financial models I had built over the past 6 months. Even though I was excluded from the family business, I still had ways of determining their operating budget. David was a sloppy manager. He often bragged at family gatherings about their quarterly shipments and supply chain volume. Using those boastful metrics combined with standard industry overhead costs, I reverse-engineered their entire balance sheet. I knew their exact margin of error down to the dollar. Michael & Son's industrial supply ran on razor-thin liquidity. They kept their cash tied up in physical inventory and relied heavily on short-term credit to cover payroll during slow months. My father viewed cash reserves as stagnant capital. He preferred to see his money sitting on the warehouse shelves in the form of steel pipes and hydraulic fittings. That operational strategy was a fatal flaw in the modern economy. By implementing a 300% rent increase, I engineered a financial chokehold. The new lease terms would consume their entire liquid capital reserve within 3 weeks. If they chose not to pay, the document provided a strict 60-day notice to vacate the premises. I printed the document on heavy watermarked linen paper. The printer hummed, dispensing the pages with cold efficiency. I gathered the sheets and aligned the edges, tapping them against my glass desk. I slid the contract into a thick cardboard mailer. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a heavy rubber stamp and a red ink pad. I pressed the stamp into the ink and brought it down hard on the corner of the envelope. The heavy red ink spelled out "Certified" in bold block letters. It looked ominous and final. I summoned a private legal courier. 10 minutes later, a young man in a dark uniform arrived at my office door. I handed him the rigid envelope and requested priority direct delivery, requiring a direct signature from the tenant. The courier scanned the barcode on the package and handed me a printed receipt before disappearing into the elevator bank. I sat back in my chair and pulled up the tracking portal on my secondary monitor. A small green dot appeared on a digital map of Chicago, representing the courier. The chapter of my life where I sat silently and endured insults was officially closed. The tension in my office grew thick and heavy as I watched the green dot move away from the financial district. The generational gap between my father and me extended far beyond our career choices. It was rooted in how we perceived security. My father believed security was something you could touch. He believed that owning a fleet of delivery trucks and a warehouse full of parts made him invincible. He thought that because his hands were dirty at the end of the day, he was protected from the shifting tides of the corporate world. He dismissed the people who worked in skyscrapers as fragile paper pushers. But he failed to realize that the paper we pushed dictated the reality he lived in. We controlled the interest rates on his loans. We managed the insurance premiums on his trucks. And now, I controlled the very ground his legacy rested upon. The green dot on the screen crept down the Kennedy Expressway. The afternoon traffic was heavy, slowing the courier's progress. I watched the agonizing crawl inch by inch. I imagined the courier navigating the maze of concrete and steel, leaving the polished glass towers behind and entering the gritty industrial sector. The environment down there was a different world. The air tasted of exhaust and rusted metal. The streets were lined with cracked asphalt and chain-link fences. I knew the exact layout of the warehouse because I had spent my childhood sweeping those floors while my brother learned how to operate the heavy machinery. I knew the specific sound the loading dock doors made when they rolled open. I knew the smell of the break room coffee. I knew the layout of the main office, where my father sat like a king on a faded vinyl throne. The green dot turned onto West Loop Drive. My heart beat in a slow, measured rhythm. There was no joy in this execution, only a cold sense of inevitability. I was simply correcting a market inefficiency. My father had built a kingdom on rented soil, and it was time to collect the toll. The dot stopped moving. The tracking status on the screen updated to state that the courier had arrived at the destination. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. I closed my eyes and visualized the scene unfolding 3 miles away. The courier would walk through the double glass doors of the main entrance. The reception area would be noisy with the sound of ringing phones and the distant clatter of forklifts. The courier would bypass the front desk and ask for the owner directly. My father would step out of his private office, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. He would look annoyed at the interruption. The courier would present the electronic clipboard. My father would scrawl his signature across the screen without reading the delivery terms. He always signed things blindly if he felt they were beneath his pay grade. The courier would hand over the package and walk away. My imagination focused on that heavy, red, certified stamp, sitting ominously on my father's grease-stained office desk. The pristine cardboard would stand out against the backdrop of scattered invoices, dusty engine parts, and half-empty coffee mugs. He would pick up a box cutter and slice open the top of the envelope. He would pull out the thick linen paper. He would read the header identifying the new landlord as B. Michael LLC. He would read the 300% increase. He would read the 60-day notice to quit. The realization would wash over him. not as a gradual understanding, but as a sudden, crushing blow. The financial trap was perfectly calibrated. He would look at the numbers and realize his operating budget was mathematically destroyed. A sharp electronic ping echoed from my computer speakers. I opened my eyes. The tracking portal displayed a new status in bright green text. Delivered. Signature confirmed by Thomas Michael. I closed the browser window. I picked up my mobile phone and placed it in the center of my desk. The screen was black and silent. The legal demand for commercial compliance had breached the fortress. The rent increase was a ticking clock that would drain his lifeblood within weeks. My father was a man of action who solved problems by raising his voice and bullying his opponents into submission. But he could not bully a legal contract. He could not yell at a market rate adjustment. He was going to realize very quickly that his outdated loyalty and physical grit were useless against a corporate acquisition. He would search for a way out, and finding none, he would look for someone to blame. He would look for someone with corporate connections to explain how this nameless LLC had stolen his future. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark screen of my phone. I knew it was only a matter of time. The silence in my office stretched tight like a wire about to snap. I waited for the exact moment when 2 years of estrangement would end. I waited for the screen to illuminate. I waited for the panicked phone call. The dark screen of my mobile device suddenly flared to life, illuminating the polished surface of my desk. A familiar name flashed across the digital display. It was my father. Exactly 24 months had passed since we last held a conversation over the phone. Our previous phone call occurred when he phoned to berate me for skipping a mandatory family barbecue to finalize a corporate merger. During that brief and bitter exchange, he had accused me of abandoning my roots for a hollow career. He claimed I was chasing invisible money while real men built the world. Now, the hollow career had arrived directly at his doorstep. I allowed the device to ring 3 times. In high-stakes negotiations, controlling the pace of the dialogue dictates the outcome. Rushing to answer signifies eagerness. Waiting signifies control. I picked up the receiver on the 4th ring and pressed it to my ear. I did not say hello. I answered by stating my first and last name in the flat, measured tone I utilized for all incoming business inquiries. My father did not offer a greeting. He bypassed any pretense of familial warmth and launched directly into a tirade. His voice echoed through the speaker, carrying the distinct harsh resonance of a man accustomed to shouting over heavy machinery. He demanded that I sit down at my computer and utilize my corporate network immediately. He sounded breathless and frantic. He commanded me to look up a holding company registered in Delaware. He was gripping the receiver so tightly I could hear the plastic casing creak under the pressure of his calloused fingers. I remained silent, letting his panic fill the empty space in my office. He continued his rant, explaining that some nameless, faceless entity had purchased his building out from under him. He read the heading of the certified letter aloud, stumbling over the legal terminology. He spat out the name B. Michael LLC, as if the letters themselves disgusted him. He insisted that the 300% rent increase was illegal extortion cooked up by Wall Street parasites. He demanded that I leverage my industry contacts to track down the board of directors for this proxy group so he could drive downtown and confront them face to face. He wanted to handle the situation the way he handled every obstacle in his life, by intimidating the opposition with his physical presence and threatening them with his fists. I listened to the layered audio of his environment. Behind his booming voice, the industrial warehouse was operating at full capacity. I heard the rhythmic thud of a pneumatic press stamping metal. I heard the heavy crash of steel pipes being loaded onto flatbed delivery trucks. That warehouse was his entire universe. He believed he was the undisputed king of that concrete floor, and anyone who challenged his authority was met with relentless hostility. I waited until he paused to take a breath. I kept my voice devoid of emotion. I told him he did not need to drive downtown to find the board of directors. I informed him that he was already speaking to the sole managing member of the holding company. The line went dead quiet. It was not a technical disconnection, but a profound human silence. The psychological shift transmitted through the cellular network with crystal clarity. The roaring patriarch evaporated, leaving behind a cornered tenant trying to comprehend a fatal blow. Behind him, the background noise of the warehouse suddenly shifted. The high-pitched warning beep of a reversing forklift abruptly stopped. The heavy rubber tires screeched against the concrete floor, echoing sharply through the cavernous space. I heard David shouting an urgent question in the distance. My brother had recognized the tone of our father's voice and realized that something catastrophic had just occurred. He dropped whatever he was holding to run toward the main office. The sudden echoing halt of that forklift was the exact moment the illusion of their security shattered. My father struggled to form a coherent sentence, his breath hitched in his throat. He asked me to repeat myself. He wanted me to tell him it was a twisted joke. He asked if this was my petty idea of getting back at him for the comments he made at his birthday dinner. I replied that my investment strategies had nothing to do with his birthday dinner. I explained that the West Loop industrial sector was a prime target for commercial gentrification. The previous landlord had defaulted on their financial obligations. I stated that B. Michael LLC acquired the distressed debt through a standard blind auction. It was a calculated portfolio expansion designed to maximize yield. I reminded him that he was operating on an expired month-to-month agreement, which left the physical property vulnerable to a market rate correction. He had relied on a 30-year-old handshake instead of signing a binding lease. The shock morphed into a desperate, defensive rage. He tried to pull rank. He raised his voice again, reminding me that he was my father and the head of the household. He demanded that I tear up the certified notice immediately. He invoked the concept of family loyalty, shouting that I owed my entire existence to the sweat equity he poured into that supply business. He ordered me to draft a new lease, maintaining the original rent rate and guaranteeing his tenancy for another 10 years. He assumed that because we shared a bloodline, I would fold under his patriarchal authority and sacrifice my own capital to save his pride. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. I did not owe him anything. I told him that familial obligation held no legal weight in the state of Illinois. I cited Section 9 of the State Commercial Tenancy Code, outlining the rights of a property owner to enforce fair market valuations upon the expiration of a non-binding lease. I spoke to him strictly as a portfolio manager dealing with an underperforming asset. I explained that the 300% increase was non-negotiable. The modern market dictated the price per square foot. If his operating budget could not sustain the adjustment, he had 60 days to liquidate his physical inventory and vacate the premises. The strict liability of the commercial contract superseded his emotional demands. He began to stammer, searching for a loophole. He argued that the building was falling apart and the new rate was unjustified given the dilapidated condition of the facility. He claimed the roof leaked during heavy rain, the loading docks were crumbling, and the electrical grid was prone to constant failure. He thought he was negotiating a better deal by pointing out the physical flaws of the structure. He did not realize he was handing me the exact ammunition I needed for my next corporate maneuver. I seized the opportunity without hesitation. I agreed that the poor condition of the facility was a serious financial concern. I informed him that as the new legal owner, I carried a strict obligation to ensure the building met all current municipal safety codes. I told him that a formal property inspection was now mandatory to assess the damages he just admitted to hiding. I scheduled the site visit for Friday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I instructed him to have all areas of the warehouse unlocked and fully accessible to my team. I warned him that any attempt to deny entry to my structural engineers would result in an immediate breach of contract and an expedited eviction process. He tried to interrupt my instructions, but I terminated the connection. I placed the phone down on my desk. The silence in my office returned, but it felt different now. The silent proxy war had officially transitioned into an open conflict. My father was trapped by the very laws he had spent his life dismissing as paper-pushing nonsense. My brother David, however, remained an unresolved variable. He was the golden heir who was supposed to inherit the kingdom. My father had just informed me that the facility was falling apart, which meant David had been neglecting the routine maintenance for years. The upcoming Friday inspection would not just evaluate the structural integrity of the bricks, it would expose the sheer incompetence of the son my father had chosen to favor. The spotlight was about to shift directly onto David and his disastrous mismanagement of the family legacy. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my office on Thursday morning, watching the chaotic flow of downtown traffic. Rain slicked the pavement of LaSalle Street, reflecting the gray, overcast sky. Amidst the sea of sensible sedans and delivery trucks, a glaring anomaly caught my attention. It was a bright crimson Italian sports car parked directly in a commercial loading zone. The vehicle was completely impractical for city driving and carried a monthly lease payment higher than a standard mortgage. The driver's side door swung open, and my older brother stepped onto the curb. He tossed the keys to a bewildered valet, who clearly explained that this was not a parking garage. David simply shoved a crumpled $20 bill into the worker's chest and walked away, leaving his financial recklessness on full public display. David had always operated under the assumption that rules did not apply to him. Our father spent decades cultivating that exact mindset, grooming his son to inherit the throne while excusing every failure as a learning opportunity. Whenever David crashed a company truck or lost a major client, our father would pat him on the back and blame the market. That toxic conditioning forged a man who wore unearned confidence like a suit of armor. But armor is useless when you do not understand the weapons being used against you. My desk phone chimed, breaking my observation. The receptionist downstairs informed me that an agitated man claiming to be my brother was demanding immediate entry. He was currently making a scene in the lobby, threatening to bypass security if I did not come down. I instructed the receptionist to issue him a temporary visitor badge and direct him to the glass-walled executive atrium on the ground floor. I had no intention of allowing his chaotic energy into my private workspace. I grabbed a slim black folder from my desk drawer and headed for the elevator. The executive atrium was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. The ceiling soared 40 feet high, supported by sleek steel columns. The furniture was minimalist, and the acoustics were designed to absorb sound, making loud voices sound thin and weak. When I stepped out of the elevator, David was pacing across the imported marble floor. He wore his signature tailored suit, but the knot of his silk tie was slightly loosened, betraying his anxiety. He spotted me and immediately forced a wide, charming smile, attempting to project the relaxed aura of an older brother coming to check on his younger sister. He closed the distance and reached out to pull me into a hug. I stopped walking and held my ground, keeping the black folder positioned between us. His arms dropped awkwardly to his sides. The fake smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He quickly recovered and adopted a patronizing tone. He told me that our father was currently having a meltdown at the warehouse over some ridiculous certified letter. He chuckled nervously, waving a hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. He called the entire situation a massive misunderstanding and suggested we grab a cup of coffee so I could void the new lease agreement before the old man suffered a heart attack. I gestured toward a low-profile conference table in the center of the atrium. I did not offer him coffee. I took a seat, leaving him standing awkwardly on the opposite side. I informed him that there was no misunderstanding, and the contract he referenced was legally binding. I stated that the new rent rate would take effect exactly as outlined in the document. The brotherly facade vanished instantly. He slammed his palms flat against the marble tabletop, leaning over to tower above me. He lowered his voice into a harsh, aggressive whisper. He demanded that I stop playing corporate games. He insisted that I was completely out of my depth and did not understand the real-world consequences of my actions. He claimed the business was experiencing a temporary cash flow issue, and my little stunt was going to ruin the family legacy. He tried to bully me utilizing the exact same physical intimidation tactics our father employed. I did not flinch. I opened the black folder and spread the contents across the table. These were not internal company files because I did not have access to those yet. They were commercial credit reports, vendor payment histories, and public tax liens I had legally compiled over the past 3 months. I looked up at him and calmly explained that I understood the consequences perfectly. I tapped a manicured finger against the first spreadsheet. I told him to look at the numbers. I read the figures aloud, highlighting a steady, catastrophic decline. For 3 consecutive years, Michael & Sons Industrial Supply had operated at a severe net loss. I pointed to the vendor payment history, demonstrating that their accounts payable cycle had stretched from 30 days to 90 days. I exposed his reliance on high-interest, short-term loans to cover basic payroll. I clinically dissected his entire operational strategy, proving that his leadership was driving the company straight toward insolvency long before I ever purchased the property. David stared at the documents. The color drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly hue. His jaw tightened, but he could not form a coherent defense. The numbers were absolute. They stripped away the illusion of the golden air, revealing the terrified imposter underneath. I shifted my finger to the second page, which detailed the property history. I explained that a competent executive would have secured a 10-year commercial lease the moment the original building owner passed away. A real leader would have recognized the vulnerability of a handshake agreement and protected the physical location of the business. I told him his failure to execute a basic legal contract left the door wide open for a hostile acquisition. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his. I informed him that I did not ruin the family legacy. I simply bought the corpse he had already killed. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He tried to muster another threat, but his voice lacked conviction. He argued that our father built that company from nothing and would never let a spreadsheet dictate his future. He claimed the old man would find a way to pay the increased rent just to prove me wrong. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the probability of that reaction. I told David that our father might indeed try to liquidate his personal assets to save the warehouse, but I pointed out the fatal flaw in that scenario. If our father tried to save the business, he would demand a full audit of the accounts to find out where the cash flow went. He would look closely at the ledgers and discover the 3 years of consecutive losses. He would realize that the son he championed had bled the company dry. The tension in the atrium shifted from anger to absolute panic. David swallowed hard. His bravado crumbled entirely. He realized he could not intimidate someone who held the exact metrics of his failure. He was trapped between my corporate leverage and our father's inevitable wrath. If the business folded, he lost his income. If the business tried to survive, his incompetence would be dragged into the light. He took a step back from the table. His eyes darted toward the exit like a cornered animal seeking an escape route. He muttered that I was destroying our family for the sake of a real estate portfolio. He turned around and walked away, his pace quickening as he headed for the revolving doors. He did not look back. I watched him leave, knowing his illegally parked sports car was probably already sporting a bright orange ticket on the windshield. I gathered the financial reports and placed them back into the black folder. The confrontation confirmed my suspicions regarding his mismanagement, but the numbers on the public credit reports only told half the story. The scale of the financial hemorrhage did not align with the simple drop in sales. The math suggested something far more insidious was draining the capital. I suspected gross embezzlement, but I needed undeniable internal proof to initiate the final phase of my strategy. I walked back to the elevator bank and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside. My mobile device vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and checked the notification screen. It was not a message from my father or my brother. It was a calendar invitation sent to my private email address. The sender requested a discreet meeting at a high-end cafe located 2 blocks away from my office. The time was set for tomorrow morning, directly before the scheduled property inspection. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. The sender was the one person who possessed total access to the internal ledgers of Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. It was Maya. My brother's wife had just initiated contact, and her sudden appearance signaled a lethal shift in the battlefield. David thought his biggest threat was the new landlord, but his actual destruction was about to come from inside his own home. The rain from yesterday had cleared, leaving a crisp chill in the morning air. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. The establishment was a minimalist sanctuary located just outside the main financial district. It catered strictly to executives seeking discretion, offering private alcoves shielded by frosted glass partitions. The air smelled of freshly roasted espresso beans and expensive botanical perfumes. I chose a corner booth facing the entrance, giving me a clear vantage point of the door. I ordered a black coffee and waited. I needed to understand the exact motivation behind this sudden outreach. Maya was not a woman prone to emotional impulses. She calculated every variable before making a move. Her decision to contact me outside the family channels meant she had recognized a structural collapse and was taking steps to preserve her own standing. At exactly 8:45, the glass door swung open. Maya stepped inside, bringing an aura of flawless precision with her. She wore a tailored ivory trench coat over a charcoal sheath dress, looking as though she had stepped directly out of a high-fashion editorial. Her architectural bob was impeccably styled, and her dark eyes immediately scanned the room, locking onto my location. She approached the counter first, speaking quietly to the barista. As a senior corporate auditor, Maya spent her days dissecting the financial discrepancies of multinational conglomerates. She possessed an intellect that far exceeded the capacity of the men in my family. Yet for 5 years, she had endured my father's condescending remarks and my brother's suffocating incompetence. She had attended the holiday dinners and the birthday parties, playing the role of the supportive wife while quietly observing the decay beneath the surface. I always wondered when her patience would finally expire. Maya carried a ceramic cup to my table and slid into the leather booth opposite me. She placed her drink down. It was a vibrantly green matcha latte, contrasting sharply with the stark white tabletop. We did not exchange pleasantries or fake smiles. The tension between us was not hostile, but it was highly charged with unspoken understanding. We were two women who had spent years navigating a toxic, patriarchal ecosystem that dismissed our capabilities. She unbuttoned her trench coat and reached into the pocket. She withdrew a small metallic object and placed it on the table exactly halfway between us. It was a high-capacity encrypted flash drive. She rested her hand near it. Her immaculate manicured nails tapped lightly against the silver casing, producing a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. That small piece of hardware held the answers I had been searching for. I kept my gaze fixed on the flash drive and asked her what she had brought me. Maya took a slow, elegant sip of her matcha latte. She set the cup down and met my eyes with a gaze devoid of any marital loyalty. She explained that she had spent the previous evening bypassing the rudimentary security protocols on my brother's home office computer. David used passwords that were laughably easy to guess, relying on his own birth date and the name of his leased sports car. Maya stated that the public credit reports I had likely pulled only showed the delayed vendor payments and the external debts. Those reports highlighted the symptoms, but they failed to identify the actual disease. The drive, she tapped her fingernail against the metal casing again, contained the unredacted internal ledgers for Michael & Sons Industrial Supply spanning the last 4 years. Maya continued her clinical dissection of my brother's financial activities. She revealed that David was not just a terrible manager who lost money to bad market conditions. He was an active parasite draining the host organism. She detailed how he had created a network of dummy vendor accounts. Whenever the warehouse received a legitimate payment from a client, David routed a percentage of those funds into these fake accounts before recording the deposit in the main ledger. My father never noticed because he only checked the physical inventory levels and trusted his son to handle the digital bookkeeping. Maya explained that David used the siphoned capital to fund his extravagant lifestyle, paying for his expensive cars, luxury watches, and a staggering mountain of personal offshore debt. He was committing systematic embezzlement against his own family to maintain the illusion of success. The sheer audacity of his theft hung in the quiet air of the cafe alcove. I looked at the silver drive, realizing it was not just a ledger, but a loaded weapon. I asked Maya why she was handing this execution order to me instead of confronting him herself. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure pragmatism. She stated that confronting a narcissist with his own failure only results in denial and manipulation. She had wasted 5 years of her life tied to a man who viewed her as a decorative accessory rather than an equal partner. She was tired of shrinking herself to fit inside his fragile ego. She was done listening to my father lecture her about traditional household values, while his golden boy secretly robbed him blind. She wanted out of the marriage, but she refused to leave empty-handed. Maya laid out the terms of our unspoken alliance with cold precision. She knew I had purchased the warehouse building and was initiating a hostile squeeze on the business operations. She recognized that I needed undeniable leverage to crush any resistance my father might mount against the eviction. The flash drive provided that exact ammunition. If I exposed the embezzlement, my father would be too devastated by the betrayal to fight the commercial tenancy battle. In exchange, Maya needed the financial ruin of the company to occur in a highly documented public manner. Once the theft was legally exposed, she would file for divorce. She would use the internal ledgers to prove marital fraud and secure a lucrative alimony settlement, draining whatever personal assets David had left. She would walk away with a clean break and a substantial payout, while my brother faced total financial ruin. I picked up the silver flash drive. The metal felt cool against my palm. I slipped it into the inner pocket of my blazer. I told Maya that her terms were acceptable and that her strategic timing was impeccable. A faint smile touched the corners of her mouth, acknowledging the mutual respect that had finally surfaced between us. We did not need to sign a contract or shake hands. Our alliance was forged in the shared desire to dismantle the patriarchal arrogance that had dismissed us both. She finished her matcha latte in one final graceful sip and stood up from the booth. She buttoned her ivory coat and adjusted her collar. She looked down at me and advised me to bring a very good legal team to the property inspection today because the structural damage was only the beginning of the rot. Maya walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the morning pedestrian traffic. I remained in the booth for a few more minutes, absorbing the magnitude of the weapon she had just handed me. My brother thought he was clever hiding his theft behind fake invoices and misplaced fatherly trust. He thought he could bully his way out of a commercial lease dispute without his dark secrets coming to light. He was blissfully unaware that his own wife had just orchestrated his financial execution. I paid the bill and walked out onto the street, heading toward my waiting car. The formal property inspection was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. I was no longer just bringing structural engineers and compliance officers to evaluate a decaying roof. I was bringing the unredacted truth. The battlefield was set, and the impending confrontation at the warehouse would shatter my father's kingdom beyond repair. The black luxury sedan turned off the paved avenue and onto the cracked, uneven concrete of the industrial park. I sat in the rear passenger seat, watching the neighborhood transform. The sleek glass towers of the financial district vanished entirely, replaced by chain-link fences, rusted silos, and overgrown weeds pushing through the broken pavement. My driver pulled the vehicle to a halt outside the main entrance of Michael & Son's Industrial Supply. I stepped out into the damp morning air. I wore an immaculate tailored charcoal suit paired with pristine leather heels. The visual contrast was stark and highly intentional. I wanted to look exactly like a corporate executioner arriving at a decaying kingdom. 2 heavily modified utility vans pulled up directly behind my sedan. My hired personnel emerged. I had contracted a premier commercial building assessment firm and a team of specialized environmental compliance officers. They wore high-visibility vests, hard hats, and carried heavy diagnostic equipment. We formed a unified, formidable line on the broken sidewalk. The air around us tasted of diesel fumes and stagnant water. It was the scent of my childhood. But today, it just smelled like profound legal liability. I led the procession toward the main loading bay. The heavy corrugated metal doors were rolled wide open, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit interior. Thomas stood squarely in the center of the entrance, blocking our path. He wore his standard uniform of faded denim and a heavy canvas work jacket. His arms were crossed over his broad chest. David stood a few paces behind him, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. David looked terrified, probably because the flash drive currently resting in my inner pocket contained the exact roadmap of his impending ruin. My father glared down at me. He attempted to project absolute authority, puffing out his chest and setting his jaw. He loudly declared that I had lost my mind if I thought I was bringing a corporate hit squad into his facility. He cited family disrespect, shouting that a daughter does not inspect a father's life work like it is a crime scene. He told me to turn around, get back in my fancy car, and drive back to my imaginary desk job. He assumed he could physically intimidate us into retreating. He operated under the delusion that his physical presence commanded the law. I did not raise my voice. I did not take a single step backward. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of stapled documents. I held the paperwork up, keeping my gaze fixed dead onto his eyes. I informed him that this was not a social family visit. I stated that I was the managing director of the property holding company conducting a mandatory commercial safety audit. I handed him the top sheet, which bore the embossed seal of a Cook County Circuit judge. It was a court-ordered inspection mandate. I advised him that denying entry to my team constituted a direct violation of the judicial order and would result in an immediate police escort and an automatic default on his tenancy. The heavy silence of defeat settled over the loading bay. Thomas looked at the judicial seal. The blue-collar arrogance drained out of his posture. He could yell at his employees and he could belittle his children, but he could not punch a court order. He uncrossed his arms and stepped aside, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He muttered a bitter curse under his breath, but he left the pathway clear. I signaled to the lead assessor, and the team flooded into the facility like white blood cells attacking a localized infection. The dissection of the distribution center was methodical and ruthless. I walked alongside the lead structural specialist, pointing out specific vulnerabilities. My father trailed behind us, helpless to stop the unearthing of his negligence. The inspectors moved through the aisles with flashlights and digital measuring tools. They documented severe cracks running spiderwebs across the load-bearing concrete pillars. They photographed exposed electrical wiring hanging dangerously close to highly flammable packaging materials. The facility was a disaster waiting for a spark, and my father had ignored every warning sign for decades to save a few dollars on routine maintenance. The situation grew exponentially worse when we reached the rear shipping yard. The environmental compliance officers began testing the soil surrounding the main drainage grates. The results were immediate and damning. Decades of unregulated chemical runoff from heavy machinery lubricants had seeped directly into the ground. The soil toxicity levels exceeded allowable municipal limits by a massive margin. One officer noted that illegal dumping of hazardous solvents had clearly occurred over a prolonged period. The fines associated with this level of environmental contamination were staggering. Thomas tried to argue that the previous landlord never cared about the drainage system. I calmly reminded him that the previous landlord was bankrupt, and the city did not care about his excuses. We returned to the center of the warehouse, stopping beneath the highest point of the ceiling. The structural specialist aimed a high-powered laser pointer at the primary support trusses. He shook his head and recorded the findings on his tablet. He noted that the load-bearing capacity of the roof was compromised by severe water damage and prolonged metal fatigue. As he spoke, a heavy draft blew through the open loading bay doors, rattling the overhead structure. Small flakes of oxidized rust and ancient dust drifted down from the ceiling. I watched the debris fall, landing softly onto the scuffed leather of my father's heavy work boots. That falling rust was the physical manifestation of his crumbling empire. Thomas stared down at his boots, brushing the rust away with a calloused thumb. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and desperation. He demanded to know what I planned to do with this overwhelming information. He claimed the building had stood for 60 years and would stand for 60 more, regardless of what some overpaid clipboard wielders wrote down. I smiled a cold, unyielding expression. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out a copy of the new commercial lease agreement that he was currently attempting to negotiate. I turned to the section detailing property maintenance and handed the page to him. I highlighted a very specific legal provision known as a triple net lease structure. I explained that under the new terms, any and all compliance upgrades, structural reinforcements, and environmental remediations were the sole financial responsibility of the active tenant. I broke down the mathematics for him right there on the cold concrete floor. The roof replacement would cost $250,000. The environmental cleanup would require another $100,000. The electrical overhaul would add $50,000 more. I told him that he had exactly 30 days to deposit those funds into an approved escrow account to begin the mandatory repairs. If he failed to provide the capital, the business would be forcibly shut down by the city and the lease would be terminated with extreme prejudice. The sheer cost of the repairs mathematically guaranteed his bankruptcy. He did not have $500,000 in liquid cash. His credit line was already stretched to the breaking point. The reality of the financial trap closed around him like a steel vice. He realized that I had not just raised his rent, I had weaponized the building against him. While my father stared blindly at the estimated repair costs, unable to comprehend his total defeat, I noticed a subtle movement in my peripheral vision. David had retreated to the shadows near the rear plumbing access panels. His face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. The structural assessment had completely shattered their operational budget, meaning a deep forensic accounting of the company ledgers was now inevitable. The moment my father tried to scrape together the repair money, he would discover that David had embezzled the remaining capital. My brother knew his secret was days away from catastrophic exposure. I watched David stare intently at the main pressurized water line running along the back wall. His eyes widened with a frantic, dangerous calculation. The cornered heir was realizing that his only chance of survival was to orchestrate a sudden disaster and force the commercial insurance company to foot the bill. The late evening sky over Chicago transitioned into a deep, bruised purple. I remained in the quiet solitude of my LaSalle Street office, reviewing the preliminary assessment reports from the morning inspection. The estimated repair costs were climbing significantly higher than my initial projections. The structural decay was severe, and the environmental remediation alone would consume whatever capital the business had left. My father was currently trapped in a desperate scramble for cash. I knew he would demand a forensic accounting of his ledgers by Monday morning. That meant my older brother was rapidly running out of time. David had spent years siphoning the company treasury to fund his luxury lifestyle, and the impending audit would expose his theft to the one man he feared. A terrified individual possessing a fragile ego will always resort to destructive measures when cornered. My mobile device illuminated the polished surface of my desk. A single notification appeared on the dark screen, breaking the silence of the room. The message originated from Maya. She had maintained a strict silence since our covert meeting at the cafe, but her strategic timing was once again impeccable. She had likely waited until David left their home, slipping out of bed in the dark, to send the warning. I leaned forward and read the frantic, glowing text message on my phone screen. It contained only 7 words. He is in the basement with a wrench. The West Loop facility sat on top of an archaic, subterranean utility grid. The main plumbing artery supplied pressurized water to the entire industrial block. If that specific pipe suffered a catastrophic failure, the resulting flood would destroy the warehouse inventory, compromise the foundation, and halt all commercial activities. David was attempting to manufacture a force majeure event. He wanted to orchestrate an unpredictable disaster to trigger the business interruption clause in his commercial insurance policy. Furthermore, a sudden infrastructure collapse would legally shift the financial burden of the repairs back onto the property owner. He thought he could drown his embezzlement trail under 3 feet of dirty water, force me to pay for the cleanup, and collect a lucrative insurance payout to cover his stolen funds. David assumed he was dealing with an absentee landlord who only understood spreadsheets. He failed to comprehend the meticulous nature of a corporate acquisition. On the exact day the escrow closed, I dispatched a private security contractor to the property under the guise of a municipal fire inspection. They discreetly upgraded the obsolete closed-circuit cameras and installed high-definition remote sensors in all critical utility zones, including the basement. I reached for my computer mouse and opened a secure application on my desktop. I entered my biometric credentials to access the live feed. The monitor divided into a grid of stark surveillance angles. I selected the camera positioned in the subterranean boiler room and expanded the window to fill the screen. The visual feed was pristine, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single bare utility bulb hanging from a wire. David stepped into the frame. He had traded his tailored Italian suit for a dark hooded sweatshirt and stained denim jeans. He looked like a common thief creeping through the shadows of the legacy he was supposed to inherit. His face was slick, with a heavy sheen of nervous sweat reflecting the pale light. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy iron pipe wrench. The camera captured every agonizing detail of his profound stupidity. He approached the primary pressurized water main. The iron pipe was thick, coated in decades of peeling green paint, and slick with cold condensation. David looked over his shoulder, checking the dark stairwell behind him. He believed he was entirely alone, shrouded in the protective anonymity of the forgotten basement. He raised the heavy tool. He did not possess the technical skill to dismantle the industrial valve properly, so he resorted to raw, blunt force. When numbers trap a man like my brother, he always reverts to physical destruction. He swung the iron wrench, striking the brass coupling with a dull, echoing thud. The first strike only dented the old metal. David gritted his teeth and swung again, putting his entire shoulder into the motion. The sheer desperation in his posture revealed the true depth of his panic. He was literally trying to smash his way out of a financial audit. On the fourth strike, the brass coupling fractured. The pressurized main ruptured instantly. A relentless torrent of dark, freezing water erupted from the cracked seam, spraying directly into his chest. The kinetic force of the blast knocked him backward onto the slick concrete floor. The basement began to flood at an astonishing rate. The rising tide swallowed the rusted floor drains within seconds, pushing muddy water toward the electrical panels. David scrambled to his feet, dropping the heavy iron wrench into the rising pool. He made no attempt to shut off the emergency intake valve. His goal was maximum devastation. He wiped the dirty water from his eyes, pulled his hood up over his head, and sprinted up the concrete stairs, fleeing the scene of his own crime. He intended to drive back to his affluent suburb, crawl into his warm bed, and act shocked when the morning crew discovered the flooded warehouse. He planned to call the insurance adjuster and file a fraudulent claim before the sun even rose. He truly thought he had outsmarted the corporate paper pushers with a piece of iron. I watched the water level rise on the silent video feed until the lens submerged, plunging the screen into murky darkness. I did not panic. I felt a cold surge of profound victory. I clicked the export button on my security dashboard. The software immediately compiled the high-definition footage, the digital timestamps, and the remote server hashes into an encrypted archival file. The file was securely transmitted to my legal team and stored on 3 separate offshore servers, ensuring the data could never be erased or corrupted. The entire dynamic of the battlefield had permanently altered. An hour ago, we were locked in a civil dispute over commercial tenancy codes and structural compliance. Now the parameters were strictly criminal. David had crossed a fatal threshold. He had intentionally destroyed the physical infrastructure of a commercial property to trigger a fraudulent insurance payout. He had committed a documented felony on camera. I now possessed the ultimate leverage. The heavy tool he left at the bottom of that flooded basement was the final nail in the coffin of his golden boy persona. My phone vibrated a second time. It was a follow-up message from Maya asking if I had intercepted his maneuver. I typed a brief affirmative reply assuring her that the trap had snapped shut and her impending divorce was essentially funded. I closed the security application and shut down my computer. My brother thought a flooded basement would wash away the evidence of his stolen wealth. He did not realize that I was going to use that exact flood to drown the entire company. I did not intend to call the police tonight. Handing him over to the authorities was a lazy and predictable solution. I was going to weaponize the legal code to choke the life out of their operations before they could even dial the insurance adjuster. The blue-collar arrogance of my family was about to meet the crushing reality of a formal breach of lease. The morning sun crested the Chicago skyline, casting long, angular shadows across the gritty industrial district. Down in the West Loop, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp concrete and oxidized metal. Thomas arrived at the facility at exactly 6 o'clock, expecting another routine day of barking orders and moving heavy freight. Instead, he found his entire workforce standing idle in the parking lot. The main loading bay doors remained shut. A foul-smelling deluge had overtaken the subterranean levels during the night. The basement was completely submerged under a dark, stagnant pool of freezing liquid. David arrived shortly after the patriarch, playing his role with sickening perfection. The favored sibling feigned absolute shock, staring at the flooded stairwell with wide, innocent eyes. He likely placed a frantic phone call to the commercial insurance broker before he even grabbed his morning coffee. He believed his manufactured disaster was a brilliant stroke of luck. He thought the inundation would wash away his financial crimes and force the property management firm to foot the massive repair bill. He anticipated a lengthy claims process that would keep the auditors away from his cooked ledgers. He was severely mistaken. I did not contact the local police department. Dialing emergency services and handing a criminal over to the authorities is a blunt instrument. Criminal justice moves swiftly, but it often lacks the agonizing precision required to dismantle a towering ego. I chose to weaponize the municipal legal system instead. Civil litigation and administrative red tape possess a unique power to bleed an adversary slowly. I wanted the aging owner to watch his empire suffocate under the weight of binding injunctions and bureaucratic mandates. I wanted him to realize that his physical intimidation tactics were entirely useless against corporate law. At precisely 8 in the morning, a sleek silver sedan parked directly in front of the flooded distribution center. A licensed process server stepped onto the cracked asphalt, accompanied by 3 uniformed municipal safety inspectors. They bypassed the murmuring crowd of truck drivers and walked straight toward the main office. The blue-collar veteran stepped outside to meet them, his face flushed with righteous indignation. He assumed they were city workers arriving to pump out the flooded basement. He puffed out his broad chest, preparing to yell at them for taking too long to fix his problem. The process server did not flinch. He handed a thick, bound dossier directly into the calloused hands of the defeated man. He announced that Thomas was officially served with a formal notice of breach of lease. The heavy document detailed a staggering array of lease violations. It cited the structural decay discovered during the previous day's assessment. It highlighted the severe environmental hazards caused by decades of unregulated chemical dumping. And most devastatingly, it included a specific addendum detailing the intentional destruction of the primary pressurized water main. I had attached high-resolution still frames extracted from the hidden surveillance footage. The crisp, printed images clearly displayed David gripping the heavy iron wrench and shattering the brass valve. The insurance fraud was exposed before the fraudulent claim could even be processed. The document explicitly stated that the tenant had willfully compromised the physical integrity of the structure, creating an imminent hazard to the surrounding industrial block. Thomas stared at the printed photographs of his golden heir committing a felony. The color vanished from his weathered face. He looked at David, who was suddenly shrinking into the background, desperately trying to blend into the crowd of confused laborers. The patriarch could not comprehend the depth of the betrayal. The son he had groomed to inherit the throne had just handed the executioner a loaded weapon. The municipal safety inspectors moved past the stunned owner and began their mandatory evaluation. They took one look at the submerged electrical panels and the toxic chemical runoff mixing with the floodwaters. They immediately declared the facility condemned, pending a comprehensive environmental remediation and structural review. They pulled rolls of bright red hazard tape from their utility belts and began sealing every entrance. The aging owner tried to intervene, relying on his oldest instinct. He stepped in front of the lead inspector, raising his voice to a deafening roar. He demanded that they leave his property immediately. He threatened them with physical violence, insisting that nobody shuts down his supply lines. For 30 years, that aggressive posture had won every argument on the warehouse floor. Men always backed down when he puffed up his chest and growled. The city inspector did not retreat. He calmly unclipped a two-way radio from his belt and informed the enraged veteran that interfering with a municipal sealing order was a state offense. He advised Thomas to step aside or face immediate custodial arrest. The threat was not delivered with anger. It was delivered with the cold, unfeeling authority of the administrative state. Thomas froze. His massive fists clenched at his sides, but he did not swing. He realized in that agonizing moment that he could not punch his way out of a commercial injunction. He could not yell at a legal mandate. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed, and his primary weapons were obsolete. He stepped backward, allowing the inspector to pass. The lead official retrieved a thick steel chain and wrapped it tightly around the handles of the main entrance gates. He threaded a massive heavy iron padlock through the metal links. The locking mechanism snapped shut with a sharp, resounding click. That harsh metallic sound echoed across the silent parking lot. It was the definitive sound of a 30-year legacy coming to a grinding, permanent halt. The financial chokehold tightened instantly. Without an operational facility, the supply chain fractured. Delivery trucks arrived carrying thousands of dollars in perishable freight, but they were turned away at the locked gates. Outbound orders remained trapped inside the dark, damp structure. Revenue ceased entirely. The company could not fulfill client contracts, meaning their accounts receivable evaporated into thin air. Meanwhile, the fixed overhead costs continued to mount. The enterprise was hemorrhaging capital, with zero incoming cash flow to staunch the bleeding. I sat in my downtown office watching the real-time updates roll across my computer screen. The logistics software confirmed that all inbound and outbound shipments for Michael & Sons Industrial Supply had been flagged and suspended. The corporate strategy was executing flawlessly. By utilizing civil injunctions and municipal code violations, I had neutralized his revenue stream without ever stepping foot in a courtroom. I had choked the life out of his operation from a desk located 3 miles away. The defeated patriarch stood outside the chained gates, staring at the red hazard tape fluttering in the morning breeze. His kingdom was lost. His chosen successor was a documented criminal. His operating budget was destroyed. He possessed no legal recourse and no financial escape route. The corporate paper pushers he despised had dismantled his reality, using nothing but ink and administrative procedure. However, a desperate man stripped of his external power will always attempt to leverage his internal influence. Thomas knew he could not defeat me on the legal battlefield. The commercial tenancy codes were impenetrable. Therefore, he decided to change the venue. He needed to drag me into a territory where he still commanded absolute authority. He needed to utilize the one tactic that corporate contracts could not regulate. He pulled his mobile device from his canvas jacket pocket and scrolled through his contacts. He did not plan to negotiate a settlement. He intended to summon me to an emergency gathering at our childhood residence. He prepared to unleash a torrent of emotional manipulation and familial guilt, hoping to break my resolve behind closed doors. The silent siege of the industrial property was complete, but the psychological war was about to erupt inside the walls of the family home. The digital clock on my dashboard displayed 7 in the evening as I navigated the quiet suburban streets of my childhood neighborhood. My mobile device rested on the passenger seat, displaying a single text message from my father. The message did not ask for a professional meeting or a legal consultation. It simply commanded me to come to the house immediately. He utilized the exact same tone he used when I was a teenager caught missing a curfew. He intended to strip away my corporate authority by dragging me back into the domestic environment where his word had always been absolute law. He believed that crossing the threshold of his property would reduce me to a disobedient child seeking parental forgiveness. I turned my steering wheel and parked my sleek luxury sedan in the cracked concrete driveway of the split-level home. I did not drive all the way out here to ask for forgiveness. I came to deliver the final execution order. I walked up the concrete steps and pushed the front door open. The interior of the house remained perfectly frozen in a bygone era. The air carried the lingering scent of stale tobacco and pine cleaner. Faded floral wallpaper lined the narrow hallway leading into the main living room. The aesthetic was a monument to stagnant tradition. I stepped into the dimly lit space and found my father sitting in his oversized recliner. He occupied that chair like a monarch, surveying a conquered territory. David stood near the brick fireplace, shifting his weight restlessly. My brother looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed the mounting terror of his impending exposure. My father pointed a thick, calloused finger toward a floral-patterned sofa positioned directly across from his recliner. He ordered me to sit down. His voice was heavy with patronizing authority. In his mind, assuming a seated position would physically lower my posture and force me to look up at him, restoring the traditional patriarchal dynamic. I did not move toward the sofa. I remained standing near the entryway, maintaining a rigid, upright posture. My physical distance created an invisible barrier that his intimidation could not penetrate. I informed him that I preferred to stand. I stated that my schedule was highly compressed, and I only possessed a few minutes to hear his proposal regarding the commercial property eviction. The refusal to sit unsettled him. He shifted his considerable weight in the recliner and gripped the padded armrests. He decided to abandon his initial strategy of raw aggression and pivot toward emotional manipulation. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of wounded parental disappointment. He reminded me of the sacrifices he made to build Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. He spoke about the countless weekends he spent unloading freight cars and the physical toll the business took on his body. He gestured toward the framed photographs on the mantel, depicting generations of men wearing hard hats and work boots. He claimed that the warehouse was not just a piece of real estate, but a sacred family legacy. He accused me of destroying our bloodline out of petty jealousy. He demanded that I contact the municipal safety inspectors and lift the injunction immediately for the sake of our shared history. I listened to his speech without breaking eye contact. When he finally finished, I let the silence stretch across the living room, highlighting the sheer absurdity of his request. I spoke in a calm, measured cadence, devoid of any emotional resonance. I told him that he was confusing a failing commercial enterprise with a family legacy. I explained that a true legacy provides security and growth for the next generation. What he had built was a toxic, patriarchal echo chamber designed solely to feed his massive ego. I pointed out that he ignored my business degree and mocked my career because my success threatened his outdated worldview. He had blindly placed his faith in a physical building that he did not even own and a golden son who possessed zero executive competence. David could no longer tolerate the clinical dissection of his character. The cornered heir pushed himself away from the brick fireplace and took 2 aggressive steps toward me. His face flushed bright red with desperate fury. He raised his voice to a deafening volume, attempting to shout me down and regain control of the narrative. He called me a bitter corporate parasite who knew nothing about the real struggles of running a daily operation. He insisted that the business was just experiencing a temporary seasonal downturn, and my malicious legal interference was the only reason they were currently facing bankruptcy. He demanded that I leave the house and return the property deed to its rightful owners. I watched my brother perform his theatrical outrage. I slowly opened the leather briefcase hanging from my shoulder. I reached inside and retrieved a thick bound stack of printed financial ledgers. These documents were the physical manifestation of the encrypted files Maya had provided at the cafe. I stepped forward and tossed the heavy stack onto the glass coffee table resting between the sofa and the recliner. The papers hit the glass with a sharp, resounding slap that instantly silenced my brother's shouting. I turned my attention back to my father. I advised him to stop listening to his favorite successor and start looking at the mathematics. I explained that the bound pages contained the unredacted internal accounting records for his beloved legacy, covering the previous 4 fiscal years. I calmly detailed the network of fraudulent dummy accounts David had established to siphon revenue away from the primary business ledger. I described how the Golden Boy intercepted payments from their largest clients and diverted a substantial percentage into offshore personal holdings. I stated that the temporary seasonal downturn David just mentioned was actually a massive, systematic embezzlement operation. My brother had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund his luxury sports cars and his premium lifestyle, while the warehouse roof rotted and the company credit line bled dry. The air in the living room turned frigid. My father stared at the thick stack of papers on the glass table. He did not reach for them immediately. The raw truth was already settling into his bones. He looked up at David. The golden air was frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a single word of denial. The absolute terror in my brother's eyes served as a full confession. The illusion of the dutiful, hard-working son shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The patriarchal hierarchy that had defined our family for 3 decades dissolved in an instant. My father pushed himself out of the recliner. His movements were slow and remarkably unsteady, as if gravity had suddenly doubled its force. He walked past the coffee table, ignoring the ledgers completely. He moved toward an antique wooden liquor cabinet situated in the corner of the dining room. He reached inside and grabbed a bottle of cheap, harsh Kentucky bourbon. It was a bottom-shelf brand he kept around for casual drinking. He did not bother retrieving a glass. He grabbed a heavy coffee mug from a nearby side table and violently poured the amber liquid. The neck of the glass bottle rattled aggressively against the ceramic rim of the mug. That sharp clinking noise was the exact sound of his absolute authority disintegrating. He took a massive swallow of the cheap liquor, closing his eyes as the cheap alcohol burned down his throat. I zipped my leather briefcase shut and turned toward the front door. The power dynamic was permanently fractured. There was nothing left to negotiate and no emotional leverage left to exploit. My father was now fully aware that the enemy destroying his kingdom was not the corporate paper pusher standing in his hallway. The true enemy was the son standing next to his fireplace. The revelation of the theft was going to tear the business apart from the inside out. But the financial hemorrhage was only just beginning. By tomorrow morning, the reality of this internal collapse would trigger a massive external shockwave. The vendors would start calling, the payroll checks would begin bouncing, and a strategic divorce filing would hit the county courthouse. The noose was tightening, and there was no oxygen left in the room. The Monday morning sun illuminated the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. But down in the industrial sector, the shadows stretched long and cold. The municipal hazard tape remained tightly wrapped across the chained gates of Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. A logistics distribution center relies entirely on constant forward motion. When the heavy diesel trucks stop rolling, the entire commercial ecosystem begins to starve. By Tuesday afternoon, the devastating consequences of the bureaucratic blockade rippled outward with punishing speed. Dozens of commercial freight carriers arrived at the locked facility, carrying raw materials and expensive machinery components. Finding no authorized personnel to sign the intake manifests, the drivers simply dumped their pallets on the broken concrete sidewalk outside the perimeter fence. The resulting backlog created a severe logistical bottleneck that paralyzed the surrounding streets. Major regional clients who depended on those specific shipments experienced immediate manufacturing delays on their own assembly lines. The supply chain fractured, creating a cascading wave of breached contracts and unfulfilled orders. The disruption in service triggered a rapid panic among the vendor network. In the commercial supply industry, word travels faster than a wire transfer. Suppliers who had previously operated on relaxed 90-day payment terms suddenly demanded immediate cash upon delivery. They read the public municipal notices taped to the warehouse doors and recognized the unmistakable scent of a dying enterprise. The phones in my father's temporary staging area began ringing relentlessly. He had rented a cramped mobile office trailer and parked it across the street from his sealed empire. Furious creditors demanded answers and immediate financial restitution. My father attempted to project his usual gruff confidence over the phone, assuring them that the closure was a minor administrative error caused by overzealous city inspectors. He promised them their money by the end of the current week. But deep bravado is a poor substitute for actual liquidity. When Friday arrived, the automated accounting software attempted to disperse the weekly wages to the idle warehouse workers. The corporate bank account held insufficient funds. The payroll checks bounced across the city, triggering a widespread exodus of his remaining loyal workforce. My father refused to accept the reality of his depleted treasury. He drove his heavy pickup truck to the headquarters of his largest regional supplier, hoping to smooth over a missed payment in person. He walked into the supplier office, carrying a box of expensive cigars, intending to rely on his decades of shared personal history. The supplier, a man who had shared countless steak dinners with my father, refused the gift. He placed a printed invoice for $80,000 on the front counter and demanded immediate settlement. My father reached into his worn leather wallet and extracted his platinum corporate credit card. He slid the plastic across the surface, expecting the transaction to clear without issue. The supplier inserted the card into the digital terminal. The machine processed the request for several tenth seconds. A bright red notification blinked on the small digital screen, reading, "Declined." My father stared at that glowing red text, unable to comprehend the failure. The blood drained from his weathered face. He asked the clerk to run the card a second time, claiming there was a technical glitch in the system. The second attempt yielded the exact same red warning. The credit limit was exhausted. Standing in that quiet supplier office, my father finally understood the true scale of the devastation. The heavy bound ledgers I had tossed onto his glass coffee table 3 nights prior were not fabricated corporate lies. They were the undeniable truth. He returned to his rented staging trailer and opened the company accounting software on his laptop. For the first time in 30 years, he bypassed the physical inventory logs and scrutinized the digital balance sheets. He traced the phantom wire transfers and the routed deposits. He saw the exact dates and amounts his favored heir had siphoned into personal offshore holdings. The illusion of the golden sun dissolved, leaving behind the bitter realization that he had nurtured a parasite. He had spent his entire life championing a man who bled the company dry to lease luxury sports cars. At the same time, he had openly mocked the daughter who truly understood the mechanics of capital. I had weaponized the very financial system he dismissed, proving that my mastery of corporate leverage was far more lethal than his physical grit. As the internal cash flow collapsed, another precise strike landed from an unexpected direction. Maya did not wait for the dust to settle before executing her exit strategy. She moved with surgical precision. On Wednesday morning, a private process server approached David as he sat in his illegally parked vehicle outside a local coffee shop. The server handed him a thick manila envelope containing formal divorce proceedings. Maya had retained one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the state of Illinois. She utilized the encrypted flash drive to document every stolen dollar, every hidden asset, and every fraudulent dummy account. She submitted the unredacted ledgers directly into the public court record. The legal filing proved that David committed marital fraud by concealing staggering amounts of illicit income during their marriage. The settlement demands detailed in the envelope were draconian. Maya petitioned for sole possession of their affluent suburban residence, the liquidation of his remaining retirement accounts, and a substantial monthly alimony payment. The attorney calculated the alimony against his embezzled funds rather than his legitimate operational salary. The presiding judge, reviewing the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct, granted an immediate freeze on all of his personal bank accounts pending a comprehensive forensic review. David was left entirely destitute within a matter of hours. He could not access his stolen wealth, he could not pay his predatory car leases, and he could not afford to hire adequate defense counsel. He was suddenly penniless and facing severe criminal exposure for his botched insurance fraud attempt in the flooded basement. The woman he treated as a decorative accessory had orchestrated his total financial annihilation without ever raising her voice. The conflict had transitioned from a localized legal dispute into a catastrophic financial death spiral. The warehouse remained sealed behind heavy chains and municipal hazard tape. The business accounts were overdrawn. The primary successor was ruined and facing imminent prosecution. The old-school patriarch sat alone in a rented trailer, watching his entire universe collapse inward. The blue-collar arrogance that had sustained his reign for 3 decades was pulverized by the silent grinding gears of corporate bureaucracy. The noose tightened, drawing the remaining oxygen from the room. But the corporate siege was not yet complete. I monitored the accelerating collapse from my high-rise office, tracking the bounced checks and the fractured supply lines through my industry network. The property eviction and the municipal injunctions had created the initial fatal wound. But a dying enterprise can still cause damage if left unattended. I needed to apply a final tourniquet to his operational capacity to ensure the holding company faced 0 future liabilities. Michael & Sons Industrial Supply maintained a primary line of credit with a major commercial bank located in the financial district. That specific credit facility was the only remaining lifeline tethering my father to the business world. My father intended to leverage his 30-year relationship with the local branch manager to secure an emergency cash infusion. He believed a firm handshake and a promise of future returns would convince the loan officers to overlook the temporary shutdown and the frozen accounts. He failed to realize that modern banking institutions do not care about handshakes or personal history. They care exclusively about risk mitigation and asset protection. It was time to alert the financial institution to the extreme liabilities they were currently underwriting. The next phase of the corporate acquisition required a simple phone call to the risk management department. I prepared to sever his final financial artery, ensuring the old empire could never be rebuilt. The corporate ecosystem operates on a fundamental principle of risk mitigation. My father never understood this concept because he belonged to a generation that placed an irrational amount of faith in personal relationships. For over 2 decades, he maintained the primary commercial revolving credit facility for Michael & Sons Industrial Supply at a prominent regional bank headquartered in downtown Chicago. He built his financial strategy around a local branch manager named Gregory. They attended the same charity golf tournaments and shared expensive steaks during the holidays. My father operated under the stubborn illusion that a firm handshake and a shared history provided a protective shield against financial ruin. He believed that if he ever faced a severe capital shortage, Gregory would simply override the system and authorize a cash infusion based on mutual respect. He failed to comprehend that regional branch managers possess 0 actual authority during a systemic crisis. In the modern financial era, decisions are not made on the golf course or over a prime rib dinner. True power resides inside the automated risk assessment algorithms running silently on secure servers. Those algorithms do not care about firm handshakes or decades of loyalty. They are programmed to detect toxic liabilities and sever exposed arteries to protect the host institution. My next strategic maneuver required weaponizing those exact algorithms against his final remaining lifeline. I sat at my sleek glass desk and opened the encrypted legal dossier on my dual monitors. The physical property was locked down by municipal hazard tape. The internal cash flow was decimated by my brother's massive embezzlement. The only mechanism keeping the supply business breathing was that revolving line of credit. A commercial credit facility relies heavily on the underlying value of the company collateral. The bank issues funds based on the projected worth of the active accounts receivable and the physical inventory stored inside the facility. I needed to inform the financial institution that their collateral was currently inaccessible and severely compromised. I drafted a formal legal disclosure addressed directly to the Central Corporate Compliance Division of the regional bank. I did not send the document to Gregory, the branch manager. I bypassed the local hierarchy entirely and routed the communication straight to the risk management executives who controlled the master algorithms. I attached certified copies of the municipal injunctions. I included the environmental remediation orders detailing the toxic chemical runoff. I provided the documented proof of the intentional infrastructure sabotage committed by David. Finally, I appended the formal notice of commercial eviction, citing the catastrophic breach of lease terms. I printed the comprehensive packet and transmitted the files via a secure digital portal utilized by authorized real estate holding companies. I did not stop there. I picked up my office telephone and dialed the direct extension for the senior underwriter assigned to the industrial portfolio. I listened to a brief interlude of classical hold music before a sharp professional voice answered the line. I introduced myself using my official corporate title as the managing director of the property holding company. I stated that I was calling as a professional courtesy to a fellow financial institution. I informed the underwriter that a severe localized hazard had occurred at the West Loop property currently leased by their client. I maintained a clinical, unfeeling cadence throughout the conversation. I disclosed that the municipal authorities had condemned the structure pending a massive environmental cleanup. I explained that all active commercial operations were suspended indefinitely, and the physical inventory serving as their collateral was locked behind heavy chains secured by a city compliance officer. I could hear the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard through the receiver. The underwriter was pulling up the specific account profile for Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. The clicking paused for a brief moment as the sheer scale of the legal liabilities populated on his screen. The underwriter asked a single confirming question regarding the status of the commercial eviction. I replied that the 60-day notice to quit was active and the tenant currently lacked the liquid capital required to cure the extensive structural defaults. The underwriter thanked me for the prompt disclosure and terminated the connection. The transaction lasted less than 3 minutes. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle and leaned into my ergonomic chair. I knew exactly what was happening inside the banking servers at that precise moment. The underwriter inputted the municipal injunctions and the eviction notices into the master risk matrix. The computer algorithm calculated the probability of default based on the compromised collateral and the suspended revenue stream. The system reached a mathematical conclusion in a fraction of a millisecond. The active credit profile transitioned from a healthy status to a critical, toxic liability. The digital gates slammed shut, permanently severing the financial artery. 3 miles away in the gritty industrial sector, my father sat inside his cramped, rented staging trailer. The air inside the small mobile unit was stifling and thick with the scent of stale coffee. He stared at a towering stack of unpaid vendor invoices and bounced payroll ledgers. The fallout from the embezzlement discovery had left him isolated and desperate. David was gone, facing a brutal divorce and an impending criminal investigation. The loyal workforce had abandoned the perimeter fence to search for reliable paychecks. My father needed an immediate infusion of capital to appease his furious creditors and hire a specialized legal defense team. He reached into his canvas jacket pocket and retrieved his mobile device. He dialed the direct private phone number for Gregory, the branch manager. He expected to hear the familiar jovial greeting. He prepared a speech about a temporary cash flow hiccup caused by an overzealous landlord and a minor plumbing accident. He fully intended to leverage his 30 years of loyalty to secure an emergency $500,000 advance. He pressed the phone against his ear and waited for the line to connect. He did not hear the ringing tone. He did not hear his friend's voice. Instead, the call was immediately intercepted by an automated routing protocol. A cold, synthetic female voice echoed from the small speaker. The sterile recording stated that the direct extension was no longer available. The digital voice informed him that his commercial portfolio had been transferred to the Central Emergency Restructuring Department due to critical compliance violations. The message instructed him to hold for the next available loss mitigation specialist. My father lowered the mobile device. He stared at the glowing screen as the generic corporate hold music played softly in the silent trailer. The warm, friendly phone calls he had relied upon for decades were gone forever. The old-school Midwestern loyalty he championed meant absolutely nothing to a risk algorithm programmed to cut losses. His friend Gregory had either been locked out of the account or had actively chosen to ignore the call to protect his own career. He placed the phone on the folding table and opened his laptop. He logged into the encrypted commercial banking portal using his administrative credentials. He navigated to the dashboard displaying his revolving credit facility. The available balance, usually displayed in bright green numerals, was gone. A stark black line of text sat in its place, declaring the account frozen, pending a mandatory collateral audit. The realization washed over him, carrying the heavy weight of finality. He possessed no cash reserves because his son had stolen the treasury. He possessed no active facility because the city had chained the doors shut. And now he possessed zero credit because I had disclosed his toxic reality to the underwriter. I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of his kingdom without ever raising my voice or setting foot on his territory. I stripped away his physical authority and replaced it with an inescapable web of corporate procedure. He sat alone in the dim light of the rented trailer, stripped of his title and his legacy. The financial checkmate was perfect. He could not fight a computer algorithm, and he could not intimidate a bank server. The traditional patriarch was finally forced to acknowledge that the modern paper pushers he despised held the true power to create and destroy. However, an ego forged over 30 years does not simply surrender to silence. My father realized that he could not win the battle on paper. He lacked the legal standing and the financial leverage to defeat a corporate acquisition. He decided that his only remaining option was to change the battlefield entirely. If he could not fight me in the boardroom, he would attempt to destroy my reputation in the streets. He opened a lower drawer in the staging trailer and pulled out a stack of blank paper. He intended to rally the surrounding industrial district and weaponize the local community against my holding company. He prepared to launch a desperate public boycott, setting the stage for a final, devastating confrontation in front of his peers. A cornered predator often retreats to familiar hunting grounds. Stripped of his financial resources and locked out of his physical headquarters, the aging patriarch resorted to a primitive strategy. He decided to leverage the collective anger of the local working class. On Thursday evening, he rented the Community Assembly Hall, located on the edge of the industrial sector. The venue was a drafty, cavernous brick structure traditionally utilized for union negotiations and labor disputes. He dispatched a frantic summons to every major vendor, freight manager, and regional contractor associated with his supply chain. His message framed the sudden warehouse closure not as a personal failure, but as a malicious corporate assault on their entire blue-collar ecosystem. He intended to incite a district-wide embargo against my real estate investment trust, hoping to utilize mob mentality to force a legal retreat. I learned about the clandestine gathering because a nervous logistics provider forwarded the invitation to my corporate email address. The supplier wanted to ensure his own lucrative contracts with my firm remained secure. I did not view the assembly as a threat. I viewed it as an opportunity to publicly execute the final phase of his isolation. I did not prepare an impassioned speech to defend my actions. Emotional appeals hold zero weight in the unforgiving arena of commercial commerce. I relied exclusively on documented truth. I instructed my paralegal team to compile a comprehensive portfolio containing the most devastating evidence we possessed. We gathered the certified municipal injunctions, the staggering environmental toxicity reports, and the high-resolution surveillance photographs capturing the attempted insurance sabotage. We printed 50 copies of the compiled evidence on premium heavyweight paper and bound them inside rigid, glossy folders. The autumn wind howled down the cracked pavement as my driver navigated toward the assembly hall. I stepped out of the warm sedan into the frigid night, wearing a sharp-tailored trench coat over a dark wool suit. I grasped the heavy leather satchel containing the printed portfolios and approached the entrance. The parking lot was filled with heavy-duty pickup trucks and commercial transport vehicles, indicating a massive turnout. The men inside that building represented the lifeblood of the regional supply network. If my father successfully weaponized their loyalty, my holding company could face significant logistical disruptions across multiple development projects. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors at the rear of the auditorium. The rusted iron hinges emitted a low, agonizing groan that briefly competed with the amplified voice echoing from the front of the room. The atmosphere inside the hall was thick with the scent of cheap roasted coffee, damp denim, and burning resentment. Dozens of men sat in rows of folding metal chairs facing a low wooden stage. My father stood at the center of the platform, gripping a microphone with a white-knuckled intensity. His face was flushed crimson, and his posture radiated a desperate, aggressive energy. He was delivering a rousing theatrical performance designed to mask his profound incompetence. He shouted about the parasitic nature of Wall Street executives, claiming that wealthy paper pushers were actively conspiring to steal the livelihoods of honest, hardworking men. He demanded solidarity. He proposed a unified embargo, urging every contractor in the room to halt all deliveries to any property managed by my portfolio. He promised them that a united front would break my corporate leverage and restore his stolen kingdom. I did not interrupt his frantic monologue with a shout. I simply walked down the center aisle, allowing the rhythmic click of my leather heels against the hardwood floor to announce my presence. The men seated in the folding chairs turned their heads, watching my calculated progression toward the front of the hall. The murmurs of agreement that had fueled my father's speech instantly evaporated, leaving a tense, heavy silence in their wake. My father stopped speaking mid-sentence. He glared down from the elevated platform, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed a trembling finger toward me and ordered me to leave the premises immediately. He declared that corporate vultures were not welcome in a room full of honorable men. I ignored his commands completely. I bypassed the stage and approached a long folding table set up along the right wall where the most prominent regional suppliers sat. Stan, the freight manager from the birthday dinner, stared at me with narrowed, suspicious eyes. I opened my leather satchel and retrieved the first bound dossier. I placed the portfolio directly in front of him. The heavy thud of the glossy legal dossiers hitting the folding tables echoed sharply through the quiet community hall. I proceeded down the line, distributing the remaining packets to the owners of the largest logistics firms and the primary manufacturing partners. I moved with deliberate mechanical precision, ensuring every major player possessed a copy of the unvarnished truth. I turned to face the audience, resting my hands on the edge of the final table. I kept my vocal projection measured and devoid of any aggressive inflection. I advised the congregation to open the folders and review the documentation before they committed to an illegal commercial boycott. I explained that the holding company did not shutter Michael & Sons Industrial Supply out of greed. We locked the gates to contain a massive legal liability. I directed their attention to the second page of the portfolio containing the municipal environmental assessments. I explained that the soil beneath the warehouse was heavily contaminated with toxic chemical runoff. I informed the room that any transport vehicle crossing into that condemned hazard zone risked an immediate quarantine by the municipal health department. A quarantine meant their expensive trucks would sit idle in impound lots for months, draining their own operating budgets. The blue-collar camaraderie in the room began to fracture. The suppliers flipped through the glossy pages, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to profound concern. I delivered the final devastating blow by directing them to the surveillance photographs at the back of the dossier. I announced that the chosen successor of the Michael family empire was currently facing imminent criminal prosecution for a documented felony. I pointed to the clear images of David destroying the pressurized water main. I introduced the harsh reality of vicarious liability into their mental calculus. I explained that if they willingly continued to extend credit or conduct transactions with an entity actively under investigation for insurance fraud, their own commercial underwriting premiums would skyrocket. Their business insurance providers would flag them as high-risk associates, effectively destroying their profit margins. The psychological shift in the auditorium was absolute and immediate. The abstract concept of loyalty cannot compete with the terrifying prospect of financial ruin. These men ran their own companies, and they understood the unforgiving nature of regulatory compliance. Doing business with my father was no longer a badge of honor. It was a severe, unmitigated legal hazard. Stan closed his glossy folder. He did not look toward the stage. He simply stood up, pushed his metal chair backward, and walked down the center aisle toward the exit. He did not say a single word. His silent departure triggered a massive chain reaction. One by one, the contractors, suppliers, and freight managers grabbed their coats and filed out of the drafty hall. They abandoned the embargo before it even began, driven entirely by the primal instinct of self-preservation. Within 5 minutes, the cavernous room was completely empty, save for myself and the defeated patriarch standing on the wooden stage. The public mask he had worn for 30 years lay shattered on the floor. He could no longer play the victim of corporate greed, because I had just proven that his own gross negligence and his son's criminal behavior were the true architects of his demise. He stared at the empty metal chairs, his broad shoulders slumping forward in total surrender. He was completely isolated, stripped of his peers, his vendors, and his reputation. The threat of a highly publicized commercial eviction now loomed over his head, promising to turn his final days in the industry into an embarrassing spectacle. The board was cleared of all defending pieces. The stage was perfectly set for the final checkmate. Tomorrow morning, he would have no choice but to walk into my downtown high-rise and beg for a surrender on my terms. The sky above LaSalle Street presented a stark, cloudless blue on Friday morning. I sat behind my glass desk on the 42nd floor, waiting for the inevitable conclusion to a week of calculated destruction. The morning commute pulsed below my high-rise window, sending faint tremors through the polished floorboards. My office remained a sanctuary of sterile precision, smelling faintly of expensive leather and filtered air. Exactly 1 month ago, I sat in this precise location, orchestrating the silent acquisition of a distressed industrial parcel. Today, the architect of my childhood alienation was traveling up the high-speed elevator to surrender his entire reality. The intercom on my desk chimed with a soft electronic tone. My executive assistant informed me that a gentleman lacking an appointment was standing in the lobby requesting a brief audience. I instructed her to grant him access and direct him toward my corner suite. I did not stand up to greet him when the heavy oak door swung open. I remained seated, projecting the immovable authority of a reigning executive. Thomas stepped across the threshold, carrying the physical toll of the past 96 hours on his broad frame. He looked profoundly diminished. The booming patriarch who held court at the steakhouse had vanished entirely. He wore a faded navy suit that hung loosely from his shoulders, suggesting he had lost weight over the course of a few sleepless nights. His face was drawn, his skin possessing a gray, sallow quality. He did not attempt to puff out his chest or raise his voice. He crossed the expansive carpet with slow, hesitant steps, looking around the immaculate corporate environment as if he had wandered onto a foreign battlefield where he did not speak the language. He stopped in front of my desk, staring at the dual monitors and the organized stacks of legal briefs. I gestured toward the low-profile guest chair positioned opposite my workstation. He sank into the seat, exhaling a long, ragged breath. When I was a young girl, he occasionally brought me to the distribution center on Saturday mornings. He always banished me to the dusty break room with a coloring book, while he took David onto the floor to operate the heavy machinery. He told me the warehouse was a dangerous place for a little girl, and that commerce was a realm reserved for men. Now, the little girl banished to the break room dictated whether his bloodline survived the upcoming fiscal quarter. The silence in the room stretched, pulling the tension tight. He finally broke the quiet, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual commanding resonance. He asked me what it would take to end the siege. He admitted that the bank had frozen his accounts and the vendors had abandoned his supply chain. He confessed that the municipal authorities were threatening a public commercial eviction on Monday morning. Such a spectacle would invite the local news affiliates to broadcast his ruin, destroying his reputation across the entire Midwestern logistics industry. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked down at the carpet and whispered the most painful truth of all. He acknowledged that the civil authorities possessed the security footage of David destroying the pressurized utility main. If that digital evidence reached the district attorney, my brother would face an immediate indictment for felony insurance fraud and intentional destruction of property. A conviction carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. Thomas was no longer fighting to save his business. He was begging to keep his favored heir out of a state penitentiary. I maintained a flat, unreadable expression. I opened my desk drawer and retrieved a single, rigid document folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the glass desktop. I informed him that I possessed the authority to halt the municipal eviction process. I stated that the holding company could decline to pursue criminal property damage charges regarding the flooded basement, effectively suppressing the security footage. I offered him a clean exit and a guarantee of his son's freedom. He looked up, his eyes searching my face for a hint of familial mercy. He asked how much capital I required to execute the pardon. He offered to sell his personal residence and liquidate his meager retirement portfolio to cover the environmental remediation costs. He assumed this was a simple financial extortion play. I shook my head slowly. I explained that his personal residence held a secondary mortgage and his retirement portfolio was virtually non-existent. I told him I did not want his money because his money was an illusion. I reached out and opened the rigid folder, revealing a meticulously drafted asset purchase agreement. I rotated the document so the text faced him. I detailed the exact terms of my ruthless bargain. I demanded the complete and total transfer of his intellectual property. That included the proprietary client list, the vendor network logistics routes, and the brand trademark of Michael & Sons Industrial Supply. I required the unconditional surrender of all remaining physical assets, including the fleet of delivery trucks, the heavy warehouse machinery, and the remaining unruined inventory. I stipulated that the transfer would execute directly into the holdings of B. Michael LLC. Finally, I included a binding non-disparagement clause and a mandatory requirement that he publicly step down from all executive duties immediately. He stared at the bold legal heading reading the draconian terms. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He pointed a shaking finger at the purchase price listed on the second page. He choked on his words, noting that I was demanding his entire life work for the sum of $1 single. He asked how I could justify stripping away 3 decades of sweat equity for a piece of pocket change. I leaned across the desk, closing the physical distance between us. I kept my vocal delivery chillingly calm. I reminded him that his sweat equity was currently drowning in toxic sludge and fraudulent accounting. I pointed out that his business possessed 0 actual value. It was a rotting carcass weighed down by environmental fines, municipal penalties, and a shattered reputation. I was not stealing a kingdom. I was offering to absorb a catastrophic liability to save his son from wearing a prison uniform. The $1 purchase price was simply a mandatory legal formality required to bind the contract in the state of Illinois. The agonizing reality of the checkmate paralyzed him. He was trapped in a perfect, inescapable snare. If he refused the deal, the eviction proceeded, the environmental fines bankrupted him personally, and David went to jail. If he accepted the deal, he saved his son, but he lost his identity, his authority, and his legacy. He looked at the printed contract, and then he looked at me. He searched my eyes for the daughter he used to belittle. He only found a corporate predator staring back. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, signaling his total psychological surrender. He nodded once, a slow, mechanical gesture of defeat. He whispered a quiet request for a pen. I opened the velvet-lined tray on my desk. I bypassed the standard office supplies and retrieved a heavy silver writing instrument. It was the exact same corporate pen my mother had gifted me for my college graduation. It was the same tool I utilized 30 days ago to sign the proxy acquisition documents that purchased his building. I held the silver cylinder out toward him, bridging the gap across the glass surface. He reached out to accept the offering. I watched the trembling of his calloused hand as his rough fingers closed around the smooth, polished metal. The man who prided himself on his physical strength could barely hold a simple writing tool steady. The tremor traveled up his arm, betraying the profound devastation tearing through his nervous system. He brought the pen down to the signature line at the bottom of the final page. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the ink cartridge hovering just above the paper. Then he pressed down. He signed his name with a jagged, uneven script, formally, legally, and permanently surrendering his entire company to the paper pusher he had mocked. He placed the silver tool back onto the desk. He did not say another word. He stood up, turned around, and walked out of my office, leaving his empire behind in a rigid cardboard folder. I sat alone in the quiet suite looking at the finalized document. The victory was absolute, and the vengeance was secured. I now owned the physical dirt, the brick structure, the intellectual property, and the fleet of trucks. The patriarch was dethroned, and the incompetent heir was neutralized. However, inheriting a toxic, dying logistics firm presented an entirely new logistical challenge. I did not actually desire to run a failing blue-collar supply chain. The final phase of my strategy required a ruthless liquidation and a calculated reward for the inside ally who made this execution possible. I reached for my phone to call Maya, knowing the ultimate resolution of this empire was about to begin. The ink on the transfer agreement dried, confirming my undisputed ownership of the fallen supply empire. I did not spend a single moment celebrating the acquisition, because maintaining a failing logistics firm was never my objective. A rotting carcass attracts parasites and drains capital. The immediate phase required surgical liquidation. I summoned my private asset management team and dispatched them to the West Loop facility. They bypassed the chained gates and began cataloging every tangible item remaining inside the dark, damp structure. I sold the fleet of delivery trucks to a competing regional distributor who rebranded the vehicles within 24 hours, erasing our family name from the highways. I auctioned the heavy machinery, the specialized forklifts, and the enormous pneumatic presses to a scrap and salvage syndicate. The physical inventory that my father had worshipped for 3 decades, the steel piping, the brass fittings, and the industrial lubricants, was packed into standard shipping containers and liquidated for a fraction of its retail value. I erased the tangible footprint of his legacy in less than 72 hours, leaving the concrete floor entirely bare. During the meticulous liquidation process, I addressed the lingering issue of my older brother. David did not possess the courage to face me in person. He cowered in a rented weekly motel room, hiding from the fierce divorce proceedings and the mounting debt collectors. I did not grant him the dignity of a formal termination meeting. I drafted a standard corporate dismissal notice, terminating his employment effective immediately for gross misconduct and fiduciary negligence. I sent the document via certified digital delivery, ensuring a permanent legal record of his removal. The notification stripped away his remaining corporate benefits, terminating his premium health insurance and voiding his deferred compensation packages. The golden heir who was supposed to inherit the kingdom was unceremoniously fired by the sister he had spent his entire life mocking. He was left with nothing but the clothes in his suitcase and a pending criminal investigation that I could choose to reactivate at any convenient moment. He was finally forced to exist in a reality where his unearned confidence could not pay the rent. The physical business was gone, but the real estate remained. The true value of the hostile acquisition always rested within the underlying dirt. I initiated the environmental remediation protocols, utilizing the capital generated from the asset liquidation to fund the hazardous cleanup. Heavy excavation crews arrived at the property, pulling up the contaminated soil and sealing the rusted subterranean drainage pipes where my brother had attempted his foolish sabotage. Once the site met stringent municipal safety standards, I brought in the commercial demolition contractors. The heavy wrecking spheres pulverized the 60-year-old brick walls. The corrugated metal roof collapsed inward, sending a final plume of ancient dust into the Chicago sky. The air tasted of pulverized mortar and oxidized iron. The warehouse where my father had ruled his blue-collar domain, dispensing his outdated wisdom and demanding blind loyalty, was reduced to a flat expanse of grated gravel. I watched the final bulldozer clear the debris, feeling a profound sense of closure. I now held the pristine deed to a prime 3-block radius in a district slated for imminent residential rezoning. The land value escalated daily, driven by urban development trends. In a few years, luxury condominiums, upscale retail spaces, and modern tech incubators would stand where the rusted silos once dominated the skyline. I had transformed a decaying industrial liability into a pristine, high-yield portfolio asset. The old guard believed that building a legacy meant stacking bricks, hoarding steel, and shouting orders across a noisy loading bay. I proved that a true legacy is agile, invisible, and infinitely scalable. Wealth in the modern era is defined by the ability to control systems rather than the ability to lift heavy objects. A week after the demolition concluded, my office telephone buzzed. The receptionist announced the arrival of a scheduled guest. The heavy oak door opened, and Maya stepped into my corner suite. She looked entirely revitalized, shedding the suffocating weight of her former marriage. She wore a sharp, tailored midnight blue suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. Her high-profile divorce was nearing a final favorable settlement. Armed with the unredacted financial ledgers, her legal counsel had successfully cornered my brother, stripping away his remaining hidden accounts, and securing a devastating alimony judgment. She had walked away from the toxic domestic environment with her dignity intact and her financial future guaranteed. She sat in the low-profile guest chair opposite my desk. We did not discuss the ruins of her marriage or the demise of my father's operation. We focused strictly on the future. I slid a formal employment contract across the glass surface. I offered her the position of senior financial auditor within my real estate investment trust. I needed a brilliant analytical mind who could dissect complex corporate ledgers and identify hidden vulnerabilities before they compromised the broader portfolio. She possessed the exact, ruthless precision my firm required. She reviewed the compensation package, noting the lucrative salary, the performance bonuses, and the extensive executive benefits. A genuine smile touched her lips, revealing a rare expression of authentic professional respect. She retrieved a pen from her briefcase and signed the document, solidifying a lethal alliance forged in the fires of domestic retribution. She was no longer a silent observer trapped in a dysfunctional family dynamic. She was a key strategist in a thriving corporate empire. Maya departed the office, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary of the 42nd floor. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting a warm golden hue across the downtown architecture. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window. I placed my fingertips against the cool, thick glass, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city. Down below, millions of people navigated the congested streets, fighting for their own sliver of security. My father was somewhere down there, navigating a harsh new reality where his physical strength and his loud voice commanded zero respect. He had spent his life dismissing the corporate sector as a realm of fictional paper pushing. He learned too late that those pieces of paper dictate the terms of existence for everyone operating within the modern economy. The rigid social hierarchy he tried to enforce was a fragile illusion, easily dismantled by proper leverage. The internal conflict that had defined my early career dissolved in that quiet moment. For years, I had harbored a lingering desire to prove my worth to the patriarch who refused to acknowledge my capabilities. I had chased professional milestones, hoping to earn a nod of approval from a man who only valued manual labor and blind obedience. I realized, standing above the city, that seeking his validation was a hollow pursuit. His approval was a depreciating currency holding zero market value. I did not need him to understand my success or respect my authority. I had orchestrated his downfall, utilizing the very systems he despised. I had beaten him at a game he did not even know he was playing. The ghosts of my childhood alienation were finally excised from my psyche. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the urban landscape into twilight. The streetlights flickered to life, tracing the glowing arteries of commerce that pumped wealth through the metropolis. Behind me, the automated building systems triggered the exterior signage, illuminating the corporate logo mounted on the facade of the tower. A soft, ambient glow spilled into my darkened office, casting long shadows across the imported carpet. I looked at the glass pane in front of me. The reflection of the newly installed B. Michael Holdings sign glowed brightly in the transparent surface, overlaying the glittering Chicago skyline. The bold, illuminated letters hovered like a crown above the city, representing the culmination of my strategic vision. I did not just get revenge against a toxic family dynamic. I claimed my rightful place at the apex of the commercial food chain. I no longer craved his validation because I owned the very ground he used to walk on. The story of the Michael family is not merely a tale of corporate acquisition or a satisfying execution of financial retribution. When the dust finally settles from the demolished warehouse and the neon glow of victory illuminates the Chicago skyline, a profound and unsettling silence remains. As someone who walks the path of self-cultivation, observing the turbulent, often heartbreaking currents of modern society through a lens of spiritual grounding, I see this narrative not as a triumph of modern finance over blue-collar grit, but as a tragic autopsy of the traditional American family. It serves as a mirror held up to our deepest misunderstandings of legacy parenting and what it truly means to build a life of enduring value. In American culture, we hold a deep, almost mythological reverence for the self-made patriarch. We romanticize the calloused hands, the early mornings, and the tangible empires forged from steel and concrete. But Thomas Michael's fatal flaw was confusing a commercial enterprise with a family legacy. For parents across this country, the message echoing from that empty, graded gravel lot is a desperate warning about the necessity of emotional awareness and fundamental fairness in raising children. A true legacy is not a brick building you leave behind. It is the character, the moral compass, and the emotional resilience you instill within the souls of your children. By blindly favoring a son who mirrored his physical image while routinely dismissing a daughter whose brilliant intellect threatened his fragile ego, Thomas did not just build a failing supply business, he engineered a fractured, dying family. To parents navigating the complexities of the traditional household, this story demands a harsh self-audit. Raising children requires a bedrock of honesty. When we shield our favored children from the consequences of their actions, as Thomas did with David, we do not protect them, we cripple them. We raise adults who lack dauduk, moral integrity, because they have never been forced to face the truth of their own flaws. Conversely, when we withhold affection and validation from the children who do not fit our predetermined molds, we force them to harden their hearts just to survive the coldness of their own homes. Parenting is not about demanding blind loyalty. It is about cultivating an environment where every child feels seen, valued, and held to the same standard of fairness. To the young adults and youth navigating the heavy, sometimes suffocating expectations of these traditional family structures, Berenice's journey offers a vital, if dangerous, lesson. You cannot wait for the people who misunderstand you to suddenly wake up and validate your worth. Validation is not a currency dispensed by parents or society. It is a resource cultivated from within. It requires niluk, a relentless inner resilience, and willpower to define your own reality and trust your own capabilities. You must learn to stand firm in your truth, even when the people sitting at the head of the dinner table tell you that your contributions are meaningless. However, from the perspective of a spiritual cultivator, the tragedy of the Michael family is rooted in a collective, generational failure to practice self-correction, the daily, quiet act of Tu Suo Chin Min. In our relentless pursuit of the American dream, we frequently turn our gaze outward. We seek to conquer markets, accumulate material wealth, and dominate our peers to prove our significance. But a life of true harmony requires turning the gaze inward. It demands Tri Tui, the profound, unclouded wisdom that comes from honest self-reflection. If the patriarch had possessed the wisdom to look inward, to tame his arrogant ego, and truly appreciate the brilliant daughter sitting in front of him, he would have never lost his empire. If the golden son had practiced moral integrity instead of feeding his vanity with stolen wealth, he would not be facing total ruin. A beautiful, stable life is not achieved by manipulating ledgers, intimidating subordinates, or hoarding physical assets. It is built on the unglamorous daily practice of fixing our own internal flaws, treating others with unwavering fairness, and aligning our actions with truth rather than ego. Stories like these force us to confront the darkest, most hidden corners of our own family dynamics. They ask us to evaluate the silent resentments we harbor, the favoritism we unconsciously practice, and the conditional love we sometimes offer. If you find yourself reflecting on your own life, your own parents, or your own children through these narratives of betrayal, resilience, and complex justice, I invite you to like, subscribe, and follow Morning Revenge. Join our community as we continue to explore the raw, unfiltered realities of human relationships and the profound lessons hidden within our darkest conflicts. But as we close the chapter on Berenice Michael standing victorious and looking out from her pristine glass tower, we must ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. We cheered for her. We applauded as she systematically dismantled the toxic patriarchy that held her down for 30 years. We felt a visceral, undeniable satisfaction when the heavy iron padlock snapped shut on her father's arrogance, proving once and for all that she was the master of her own fate. Yet look closely at what remains. Conventional thinking dictates that Berenice won. She conquered the empire, achieved total financial independence, and proved her oppressors unequivocally wrong. But from a higher spiritual vantage point, did she truly break the cycle of toxicity? Or did she simply change the locks on the cage in her relentless quest to destroy her father's kingdom? She adopted his exact ruthlessness, replacing his physical intimidation with corporate brutality. She sits alone in a sterile room on the 42nd floor, isolated, holding the deed to a kingdom built on the ashes of her own family. The ultimate illusion of revenge is that it promises liberation, but it only delivers a seamless transfer of power. She did not defeat the dragon. She merely inherited its scales. True liberation does not come from crushing those who failed to love you. It comes from outgrowing the desperate need for their defeat. Sometimes the most profound victory a human being can achieve is not acquiring the deed to the battlefield, but possessing the wisdom to walk away from the war entirely.